make, move, wait! Anyway, the best way to visualize all of this talk about death from the highest and most abstract level or perspective is to take a look at this thing called the survivorship curve. The survivorship curve is a visualization of how species cluster throughout their various age brackets as they die or as they age, right? And all animals have different strategies, if you want to call them that, or just ways that this transpires. And you can see the humans here, this curve that humans have, right? And the question is, how far, right? This is what lifespan extension is about. How far can we push this curve out along the x-axis, the time axis? And then this other question is what I call the, I don't know what to call this, but the other question is, how sharp can we bend the knee, right? So how many people can we get out further along that axis, right? So that's increasing the average age of death, I guess we'll say. And then for now, absent any stunningly new and brilliant technology, it appears there's a really sharp upper limit, right? The theoretical limit being 125 and the practical limit being about 117. This is the theoretical age limit that I talked about earlier, though. And this guy's gonna talk about it for a second, okay? You run into basic limitations imposed by body design, says 𝘃𝙪𝙢𝙪, a biodemographer at the University of Illinois at Chicago, noting that there are certain cells that do not replicate, right, such as neurons. They will continue to wither and die as a person ages, placing upper boundaries on a human's natural lifespan. Do you really think that a diet, right, or any diet is going to prevent or change or move this natural boundary, the upper limit of this natural boundary? They have not, they are not, and they most likely will not. No, let's just say it. They have not, they are not, and they will not. They're not going to. Diet barely does anything now in the lifespan lengthening department, despite the protestations of militant vegans or carnivores. The reason, however, that we need to compress morbidity, or that we want to, is not because of how fragile we are and because we just wither up and die if we don't do this. In fact, it's actually the opposite. The reason that we need to compress morbidity is because, to adapt an Adam Smith quote, there is a great deal of ruin in a human body. The problem with sickness in the modern world is not that it kills you. The problem with sickness in the modern world is that it doesn't just kill you. In the modern world, people are capable of limping along for a very long time with all kinds of awful morbidities. Remember the cloud-based kidneys thing I was talking about in my best argument for veganism video? We, human beings that is, can even survive some pretty traumatic shit and keep going. I don't know if you've ever heard that story. I think the Murder Podcast chicks talked about it. Mary Vincent, there's a link to that down in the description below, that story. Survived some pretty insane shit. I think this dude like chopped her arms off and threw her in a culvert, then like came back and picked her. I mean, he did like all kinds of awful things to this girl and she lived, okay? Then that guy actually went on to like murder some more people, I think, after he got out of prison too. It's pretty fucked up. People can live without their colons, they can live without their stomachs, they survive aggressive cancers. People survive horrifying burns that cover large amounts of surface area on their bodies. My uncle, in fact, well, he's really like my cousin, but my uncle did this. Life was like 65% of his body was covered in second-degree burns, man. This is insane. Like normally 50% of people die when that happens. They survive flesh-eating bacteria. Some people are brought right to the very doorstep of death itself and dropped off, and somehow they turn around and walk away. But human beings don't always survive. We are in fact incredibly fragile in some ways. There's been people that have died by a single punch, a single blow to the wrong part of the head. We can choke to death on peanuts. We can have deadly allergic reactions. People die from constipation, from contact with lawnmowers, accidental suffocation in bed. While we're on the subject, people have literally died from slipping on banana peels. This isn't quite like a slipping on fruit story, but it started off that way. Bobby Leach, who was actually, I think, the second person to survive a trip in a barrel over Niagara Falls, he slipped on an orange peel, but then ended up in the hospital, got a staph infection essentially, and ended up dying. But a lot of people die that way from the hospital, essentially, from an infection in the hospital. So these strange deaths, however, that we've been talking about, they don't really change the shape of the survivorship curve. Overall, they're freak accidents. Life's weird, dude.
Life's weird, isn't it? Buckle up.
So this chart that we're going to talk about, right, it's for England and Wales, but it looks very similar for most of the modern Western world in general. And as you can see from this chart, basically the longer we have lived, okay, the longer we will live. This means that we are Lindy up to a certain point, obviously, because we all die. So that means if we make it to 50, right, we're more likely to make it to 70 than we are at 40. And if we make it to 60, we're more likely to make it to 70 than we were at 50. And this pretty much holds true through each decade and through all of the ages. That's why as you look at the chart, you see this very smooth sort of upward flow and convergence to that 70 to 80 range that we were talking about earlier, because that's the x-axis is time, right? And those lines independently represent the amount of that you can be expected to live from a certain age, right? And so we start at birth on the bottom and we work our way up. But incidentally, you see the the big dip in this chart around 1919. You want to take a guess what that is? That's the Spanish flu, folks. That's what a real pandemic does. But we're not gonna talk about that. Say it with me now. Chronological age is the single greatest predictor of death. It always has been, and it always will be. I mean, do you really think that it was vegetarianism that took us from an average life expectancy at birth of 41.6 years to 81.1 years from about, oh, I don't know, 1850 it looks like on the chart, to 2017 or however far this chart goes, 2013? The way that you hear vegetarians talk as the years went on, right, from 1850, and we started eating more and more animal products and more meat, their life expectancy would have actually decreased. But of course, the contention is, well, but all this other stuff that society did isn't what enabled us to live longer. Yes, yes, it is. Not vegetarianism, right? This other stuff that we're doing, not our diets. So, however, are you so naive that you believe it was this modest increase that we actually had in access to animal products that were responsible for this dramatic increase in lifespan? Right? Don't be a naive carnivore. That's not what happened. Okay, it was very clearly like the conquering of infectious diseases, right? Sanitation and medical technology, cleanliness, hygiene, and all of this other stuff that enabled this radical extension, this doubling of lifespan. It wasn't CrossFit, it wasn't yoga, it wasn't a lack of processed food, okay? You think there are, or I don't know, do you think there are a few like Methuselah-aged carnivores or vegans who are throwing off the fucking average in 2013? Like all of us are actually dying at 40 and they're all living to 1,000? The chart looks this way because in some fundamental sense, right, we're not at war with shitty diets. I am on a very personal jihad against ultra-processed foods or refined foods. But that's just me personally. At the civilizational level, we are not. Nevertheless, despite that fact, right, despite the fact that the grocery stores are filled with this fucking garbage, people still live, like our lifespans don't seem to be much affected by it now, do they? So as a civilization, and I'm gonna get a little mystical here for the next few minutes, right? And I know we've already been talking a long time. So if you wanna skip past the woo-woo shit, I would highly suggest that you skip to part 2 of these videos. But as a civilization, what are we at war with, right? Well, as a species, we're at war with entropy. We are battling against the very heat death of the universe. We're at war with the final and complete nothingness. We're at war with the jaws of the abyss and the gaping maw of the darkest darkness. A darkness that is standing at the end of all times and the end of all universes and is seeking to devour everything and turn it into nothing. The great destructive feast of Shiva that clears the way for Brahma to recreate the world, that's what we're at fucking war with. We consume energy so that we can organize matter. And we do this so that we can avoid for as long as possible that final decay that is waiting for each and every one of us at the end of our time here on Earth. We're just here in this universe, just making an allowance for space travel. While we are here, in more ways than one, we pass on the torch of life that has been passed on to us. Hopefully, we teach those to whom we have passed this torch to do the same and to do it well. so that we can push off that final and ultimate decay that is waiting for our species as a whole as long as possible. This means that good nutrition is saying no to nothingness. Good nutrition is saying no to decay. Good nutrition is saying yes to Vishnu, the maintainer, and saying you to Shiva, the destroyer. In his 1944 book, What is Life?, the Austrian physicist Schrödinger, is it a hard G or a soft G? I'm not sure. Who in 1933 had won the Nobel Prize in Physics, theorized that life, contrary to the general tendency dictated by the second law of thermodynamics, which states that the entropy of an isolated system tends to increase, decreases or keeps constant its entropy by feeding on negative entropy. That is, life feeds on negative entropy, which is really just life. Life feeds on life. The problem of organization in living systems increasing despite the second law is known as Schrödinger's paradox. This is what differentiates life from other forms of the organization of matter. Although life's dynamics may be argued to go against the tendency of the second law, life does not in any way conflict with or invalidate this law, because the principle that entropy can only increase or remain constant applies only to a closed system, and living systems are open systems. Schrödinger then asked the question, how does the living organism avoid decay? The obvious answer: by eating, drinking, and breathing. For some reason, despite this fact, the fact that we are open systems, we just can't avoid that final and ultimate decay that is waiting for us much longer than 80 years. Continuing with the mystical shit. Hegel. The Hegelian dialectic. That one is a soft J. I don't know, that should be Hegelian. Yeah, no, Hegelian. The Hegelian dialectic, usually presented in a threefold manner as like thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That isn't really like what Hegel said. Hegel actually, I mean, it was problem, reaction, solution to some degree, but Hegel actually said abstract, negative, concrete. That was his favorite formulation. And he used this as a writing model or a backbone to accompany his points in many of his works. This formula, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, doesn't explain, in fact, why the thesis requires an antithesis, right? Whereas Hegel's favorite abstract, negative, concrete kind of does. It suggests a flaw or perhaps an incompleteness in the very word abstract, right? That's his initial thesis. Because it's too abstract and it lacks the negative of trial and error, right? This is kind of like what low carbers are as a whole. A bunch of us tried this shit, right? Us from the paleo community and the CrossFit community and the workout health community. And then the negative that we worked through, we realized, holy fuck, man, we need carbs like to fuel up. And I explain exactly why in my 3-part video series, 3 Energy Systems. In the Logic, for instance, Hegel describes a dialectic of existence. First, existence must be posited as pure being, Sein. But pure being, upon examination, is found to be indistinguishable from nothing. When a predicate gets too big and you can predicate it of everything, it becomes meaningless. When an explanation starts explaining absolutely everything, when you have this one golden hammer to explain all phenomenon, you're not explaining anything. When it is realized that what is coming into being is at the same time also returning to nothing. In life, for example, one's living is also a dying, which we've already talked about above or previously in the video. So both being and nothing are united as becoming, and that is Hegelian dialectics. Being, in fact, would need nothing, would need no food because it was already complete. Nothing would need no food because nothing is nothing. Only a becoming needs nourishment. While we are here, we are neither being, because we're incomplete, nor nothing, because we're clearly something. But we're manifested, both of these things, as becoming. We are becomings incarnate in the flesh. As Hegel saw, we must carry around the nothingness inside of us. We need nothing. We need room to grow. We need space to operate in. Thus, nothing forms actually a kind of something. Nothing is room for change and growth. Eventually, however, our own personal becoming stops being a becoming and we return to the nothing from which we came with what we had, which is nothing. The nothing, however, is here with us along for the ride, gnawing at us the entire trip, the entire journey, making us hungry, making us eat. In fact, all of nature is this same hungry becoming. All of nature is a conjugation of the verb to eat in both the active and passive, because nature carries around the nothing inside of it too. Something cannot survive on nothing. Something has to eat something. Nothing eventually has to eat something too. This is why the cow, the sun, the grass, and the darkness are all sacred. Family, this is the philosophy of nutrition, and this is what we do here. A little bit more woo-woo, then we're gonna move on in part 2 to something else. So, big ups to Maria Popova, I think that's how you say her last name, and her newsletter for this next bit. In fact, I'm just gonna quote her piece and link to it in the description down below as well. How much of us is alive, or really alive? What does that even mean to begin with? The book's most captivating chapter, entitled How Much of Us is Alive, explores not the existential puzzlement of the question that is best left to the poets and the artists of life, but the science, the staggering and counterintuitive reality of aliveness. Brewster writes, how much of a tree is alive? Certainly not the outer bark that falls off in dry scales or that can be scraped off down to the white layers within. And the tree be none the worse. Certainly not the wood. One often comes across old trees that have lost limbs or been carelessly pruned, which are entirely decayed out on the inside, so that nothing is left but a thin shell next to the bark. Yet these trees grow as vigorously as ever and bear leaves and fruit like a solid tree. The bark is dead. The wood is dead. And between the two is a thin layer, perhaps a quarter inch through, which is alive. On one side it is changing into dead wood. On the other side it is changing into dead bark. The new wood is alive and the new bark. Between them is something neither wood nor bark, but just living tree stuff. The green leaves also are alive, and the green twigs and the blossoms and the growing buds, but at least half of every living tree is already dead. While the larger and longer lived a tree is, the smaller proportion of it is alive at one time. What is true of trees, Brewster observes, is true of us, and not only because we see so much of ourselves in trees. We exert vast portions of our anxious creative energy on devising antidotes to our elemental fear of death, some mightier than others, and yet much of the bodies we live in are not, strictly speaking, alive at all. Our hair and nails are not alive at all, and that our outer skin, the thin skin that is, which we tear off when we bark our shins, is fully alive only on the inside. Our bark, in fact, is very much like a tree's. Each has a soft, thin, living layer on the inside which grows, hardens, dies, and forms a watertight layer over the rest of the body and cracks into scales and drops off. Where one forms cork, the other forms horn. Indeed, the cork stoppers of our bottles are made from nothing more than an especially thick, corky bark of a certain kind of oak, like the especially thick and homey soles of all barefooted savages and some barefooted little boys. With an eye to the biological fallacy at the heart of the famous biblical teaching that the life of every creature is in its blood, which is refashioned in Bram Stoker's iconic line from Dracula, the blood is the life, Brewster counters. The blood itself is dead. The watery part is just soup, water and salt and fat and jelly. The minute, coin-like red blood corpuscles carry the oxygen of the air from the lungs all over the body. But there are similar oxygen carriers, likewise dead, in bottles in the drugstores. The corpuscles are dead cells alive once, and like the hard skin cells, a great deal more useful dead than alive. After delineating how the same holds true for our teeth and the rest of our bones, yeah, your bones are really just an inorganic, inert mineral matrix, just rocks. After delineating how the same holds true of our teeth and the rest of our bones, Brewster draws out his analogy of cells as living bricks, with the caveat that even living cells are not fully alive, for the jelly of water and salt coursing through them is just water and salt, and adds, we are then built of living bricks, but of living bricks set in dead mortar. We saw that the great trees, complex and long-lived, have more wood and bark and other dead substances in them than the shrubs, herbs, and grass. These in turn are less alive than the lowly water plants and yeasts and molds which have no wood or bark at all. The same is true of animals. The jellyfishes and infusoria have neither skin, hair, bones, nails, nor blood, and are pretty much all alive. So the more a creature's life is worth, the less of it is alive. There is a little sun burning inside each and every one of your cells, except your red blood cells, they don't have mitochondria. That is the Promethean fire that's inside of each and every one of us. That's the fire that we've been passed on, the fire of life that we need to tend to and keep passing on. All we can do while we are here on this earth and alive is pass this torch to the something that we leave behind when we go. Good nutrition, however, is saying yes to life while we are here. Good nutrition is saying no to decay while we are here. Good nutrition is to play nice with Vishnu while we can. It's the only real rebellion, that is rebellion against premature decay. Taking care of your stuff. Cleaning your room. That's a decrease in local entropy too. That's life. It is wise to eat properly and to teach those around you to do so, which is what I am trying to do here. So that the matter that you are constituted of is capable of properly organizing itself. How then do we do that? How do we eat properly? How do we eat to prepare to die? Find out in part 2. That it's either click the title card when it comes up at the end of this video, or just let it autoplay. I'm probably gonna put these in a playlist and it'll just keep rolling right into the next part.